Hi, everyone. Welcome to my webinar. I hope you are all safe and healthy at the moment. And I wanted to also begin by thanking those of you who have reached out to me through the ASMALLWORLD website and app. I'm still figuring out how to use that. So if I haven't gotten back to you, apologies, but it's really nice to have been welcomed into your community. And I'm very happy to be here with you for this session. I am Deb Gruenfeld. I'm a faculty member at Stanford University in the business school, and I'm also a psychologist by training. Some people like to know that before getting too close. I don't do counseling psychology. I am an experimental social psychologist, and for the last 25 years or so, I've been studying how people deal with their own power and powerlessness. So that's what I want to talk with you about in this webinar and give you some frameworks and tactics and strategies for using the power that you have better. Before I get into that, I just want to say a little bit about the format. So my plan is to talk with you for about 40 minutes, share some slides with you and some research findings and some tactics and examples. And then I'd like to open things up to questions for the last 20 minutes. So you can share your questions in the Q&A, which I think is how you normally do things. So as I said, I'm going to be talking with you about power today. And power is a big topic. Most people who devote their lives to studying power are focused mostly on the idea that in order to be successful and accomplish our goals in life, we need more power than we already have. And it's not that I reject this perspective or the idea that, you know, we can be strategic about how we gain power over others, but I think there's much more to understanding what it means to be successful with power than just thinking about getting more. So I'm going to ask you to consider for the next 45, 50 minutes, the possibility that you might already have more power than you think. We're not always that in touch with the power we have, actually. And so what that means is that in order for you to be successful in life and have the impact you want to have in whatever roles you play in your life, you might benefit by thinking about how to use the power you already have better and in new ways. So that's what I want to talk with you about today. I'm asked often how I got interested in power, and the truth is that my interest goes way back. So this picture is actually my very first self-portrait. I drew it when I was 3, and I found this picture of myself at my mother's house in a drawer about 15 years ago. And when I saw the picture, I knew right away who it was because this person has too many eyes, a closed mouth, no real arms or hands. So I looked at this person and I said, this is somebody who sees everything and feels powerless to do anything about it. And I recognized myself in that picture right away. I think a lot of us feel this way. And in fact, for me, a lot has changed, obviously, since I drew this picture when I was 3. But this little person is definitely still with me. So the problem this creates for me, and I think it creates for many people, is that, you know, I wake up in the morning on a day like today feeling like this little person. But I have to show up on this webinar like this person, and it's hard to know where to start. So there was a time when I thought it was just me who felt this way. One of the big ahas from my work on acting with power in particular is that actually everyone feels this way. Everyone feels powerless, and there are lots of interesting reasons for this. One of them is simply that we learn about the concept of power in childhood at a time in our lives when we are at our most helpless and most dependent on other people, and that association lingers. So we're often a little bit behind in terms of keeping up with social reality when we think about how important we are to other people, how much others depend on us, and how capable we are in others' eyes. So what I'm going to ask you to consider today is the idea that to be successful with power, to be a leader in whatever role you play in life, it's important to be able to shift from the focus on trying to be your authentic self all the time. Your authentic self is the one, I think, who needs protection. And to focus more on being your most responsible self, or the person who's capable of providing protection and security to other people, because this is the responsibility that comes with holding power. So let me just say a couple words about power, what it is, and give you a moment to think about your own power. Just to define this concept for you, power is the capacity to control other people by controlling their access to rewards and punishments. That's all it is. So we sometimes confuse power with wealth. We sometimes confuse power with fame and celebrity. Power is really just an underlying capacity, source of leverage over other people. And there are many sources of power. So I'll just give you a moment to think about this. Obviously, we have power. Some of us have power by virtue of the roles that we play in life, our formal roles. So those of us who are parents, just to start there, you know, I can tell my kids that they have to do things because I'm their mom, and that's relying on my formal authority as a parent, which is not a bad or unreliable source of power when your kids are young, but as you get older, it kind of erodes. So you don't want to rely on that one, you know, too much. There are many other sources of power, so that's the good news. One of them is status, or the extent to which other people respect and admire us, and that can be independent of our actual formal right to tell other people what to do. Your power is related to your connections to other people. So if you're someone who can provide access to other people that some of your contacts might want access to, if you're potentially a source of financial capital for those people, if you have alternatives to any of your relationships. I sometimes have to remind some of the people that I work with who are struggling with a difficult boss that whenever you have an alternative to a difficult relationship, you have to put up with less, right? So you have more power to the extent that you have alternatives to the relationships that you're in. And also physical presence is a huge source of power, and many of us know this. Some people are naturally intimidating. Some people are naturally disarming. And both of those qualities are potential sources of power and ways of having the impact you want to have on others in specific types of relationships. So you can just think about that a little bit. Most of us tend to, when thinking about power, whether we're powerful enough, tend to spend a lot of time thinking about how we feel. And often our feelings about our own power are out of touch with reality. So it's very important to recognize where your power comes from and to be able to analyze your situation by looking at the sources of power that you actually have. So what this means is that if most of us have more power than we think we do by virtue of the roles we play in life and our positions in our relationships and social networks, what I want to give you a window onto in this presentation is how to think about using the power you have differently or better to accomplish specific goals. And in this space, I'm laying out what I think of as the kind of realm in which we make choices about how we use power. So we'll start with the vertical dimension. You can always choose to play your power up by advertising how much power you have, by pulling rank, by reminding people that you have the right to make or break them, by emphasizing your strengths as a way of trying to control other people. You can also make the choice to play your power down. This does not mean necessarily that you're weaker or that you have less power. It means that you're choosing not to advertise the power you have, but instead to camouflage the power that you have. And those of you who have a lot of power understand how important it is to be able to do this, right? There are many, many advantages that come with being able to show others respect, be vulnerable with others, and do the kinds of things that disarm other people so that they trust you enough to be able to connect with you on a human level. So we can all make these choices to play our power up or play our power down. What I've noticed in my research is that most people tend to specialize in one of these approaches to using power, and tend to be a little bit less flexible on the other side. So those of us who are naturally intimidating sometimes hear from others that we're too intimidating, we can't quite figure out how to back off. And then there are those of us who are naturally disarming and are told sometimes that we're too nice, and we can't figure out how to be tougher in relationships when that's necessary. So the vertical dimension is one in which I'd like you to start to think about expanding your authentic range, expanding what feels natural to you. And I'll give you some examples about how you could do that to have specific types of impacts. The second dimension I think is very, very important to recognize is the horizontal dimension. And what I'm talking about here is how you approach power in terms of what you think power is for. So what's the purpose of power? Why are you interested in having power? Why would you be using the power you have? And you can make these choices, and we all do, to use the power we have to protect other people. So we take the responsibilities that come with power very seriously, and we focus on trying to take actions that are best for the groups we're a part of, even in positions of power. And then there are those of us, and in fact, all of us do this sometimes, who think of power as a personal resource or you know, a resource that's mostly designed for self-enhancement. So there are many people who approach power this way in a kind of chronic way, but most of us use our power this way when we feel fearful. So we think of our power as a way of protecting ourselves when we feel vulnerable. And sometimes this translates into using power to protect your position. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with it, but I'd like for you to be able to tell the difference in terms of your natural responses to situations, and to be able to operate in the quadrants where you're most likely to be effective. So here's how I think about that. If you look at the diagonal, what you'll see on the, the northeast side is what I think of as the leadership zone, where you can both use a command and control approach to using power, or something more like respect and connect. And you can make those choices based on what's best for the people who depend on you. You can also operate in the southwestern side, on the other side of the arrow, where really what you're focused on is either playing your power up or playing it down as a means of protecting yourself, gaining more competitive advantage personally, or advancing your own interests. So this is a space in which we're going to be talking about doing things today. It highlights these two ways you can use power. There's a command and control approach, the respect and connect approach. I want to be very clear in saying from the start that I do not think either one of these is inherently stronger or more powerful than the other. What affects your success with these strategies is whether you can choose the right strategy to fit the situation that you find yourself in. So every person, every leader, every person who wants to use power well wants to have a way of using strength and a way of showing compassion. And again, just to reiterate something I said earlier about that, connection that some people struggle with between being authentic and, being who you need to be in order to do your job. I trust that every one of you authentically is both strong and compassionate. But what's difficult about power, and what's important from the point of view of thinking about acting with power, is whether you're able to show your strength and compassion in your actions. People can't read our minds very well. So it's important to be aware of not just whether you are strong and compassionate, but do you have the behavioral repertoire to show strength and compassion when needed. Okay, so what I want to talk about next is a little bit about how to think about the balance between these two different ways of using power and what's most useful at the moment. One of the things that's been really interesting for me as someone who studies power and leadership in this pandemic era is to look at how what we think counts for effective use of power has changed. So if you look at the management literature and the way people tend to write about power, there's been a huge emphasis for many decades now on how important it is for power holders to be able to play their power down. So the idea is that, you know, participative approaches to leadership are better than authoritative approaches, and the ability to show vulnerability and be empathetic and compassionate are much more important for people in positions of power than being able to take a command and control approach. But one of the things that's been really interesting, if you look at, you know, what's being written in the news about which of these leaders has been most effective in terms of controlling the pandemics in their countries, what you'll find is not only that many of them are women, and we can talk more about that later. What's more interesting to me, and I think more instructive for you, is to look at what they're actually doing. And what I would argue is that what's made these leaders so effective in this context is their willingness to use their power in a command and control way, and to take the personal risk of showing strength because that's what's been needed. So I'll just say a little bit more about that. Despite the management rhetoric on how important it is to empower others and to be participative, what we know from research very reliably is that in uncertain times, in difficult times, in times of crisis, people tend to prefer strong leaders. And this is one of the reasons that we've seen very authoritarian leaders rising in many countries around the world as economic conditions and climate change and the pandemic have made things more frightening for citizens all around the world. These are data that I'm showing you from a study that looked specifically at the preference for different types of leaders, both in political and in management contexts, as a function of how much economic uncertainty there was at the time. So economic uncertainty was measured in terms of the unemployment rate, for example, and how quickly it was changing, what wages looked like, and so on. And what you can see very clearly here is that the more difficult things got economically in specific contexts, the greater the preference for dominant or authoritarian leaders. So leaders who lead with strength, I would say, as opposed to compassion, and who tend to prefer a dominant as opposed to a deferential approach to leading. So we're having a moment where strength is important, and the ability to use power in a dominant or controlling way is more important, I think, than we've recognized for many, many years. And so the general rule that I'd like for all of you to think about is that when other people around you feel at their most powerless, that's a moment for you to think about ways that you can play your power up more as a way of being the power holder that others need you to be. I want to talk just a little bit about 3 examples of what it looks like to power up or to play your power up that I've seen in the news. The first one is the idea of seizing the spotlight. The second is the idea of owning your decisions. And the third is the idea of taking up space. So let me just say a little bit about each of those. This idea of seizing the spotlight is very interesting, I think, and not entirely intuitive to many of us. So it's very common in general, I think, to try to be humble, to try not to take up more time and space than you're entitled to not take advantage of your position, to hold court in an irritating way. But it's been very interesting for me to watch in the United States in particular, how the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, has recognized how important it is for him to show up in public every single day, very regularly, even when he doesn't have all that much to say, and he understands the theater of it. He comes in his suit, he's got his, he's got all the emblems around him, he's got advisors around him, and he's got, his badge on. So he's showing up in role on a regular basis. And what I think has been fascinating about watching this is just recognizing that people have been tuning in, or people were tuning in to watch him give his COVID-19 updates on a daily basis, even if they didn't live in New York, from all around the world. And it wasn't so much because we needed to hear what he had to say. He didn't always have answers. He didn't always have, I would say, practical or useful information. People were showing up because they needed to see that someone was in charge. And I would put that to all of you in situations, especially when you're in work from home situations, that it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that under these kinds of uncertain circumstances, people need to see an authority figure with both hands on the wheel who behaves as though they are under control, even if they can't change the course of history or what's happening. It's very important to be able to just step into the spotlight. And there are a lot of good examples in the course of the pandemic and how things have gone down on a global stage. The Prime Minister of Norway held a press conference just for children. And again, you can think of this as kind of, a theatrical thing to do. It's important, obviously, but also just important for her to show up in that way as a way of providing reassurance to people who may be feeling fearful, whether they're children or not. And the chief medical directors in South Korea in particular had a similar type of approach of showing up every single day to report what's going on, just so that everyone knew that there were authority figures who were in charge and had both hands on the wheel. Another example is the CEO of GM, Mary Barra. She's an alum of our school and tends to be very low-key in her role, even though she has a gigantic job. But in this pandemic, she has made the choice to, to pivot General Motors to producing more ventilators, and also to appear in a lot of press shots in these factories, watching how the work is being done. And I like to joke that you can tell how powerful Mary Barra is by noticing that she actually got Vice President Pence to wear a mask in this picture. So I give her credit for that. For those of you who find it hard to step into the spotlight when you don't know what to say, when you don't have answers, when you feel uncertain yourself and overwhelmed yourself, is a mantra that I sometimes use to coach executives in these type of situations, which is to remind yourself or say to yourself privately before you go into these situations, the following, which is, I'm glad to be here and I know what I know. So this will put you in the right mindset for being able to trust that you have what's necessary in order to provide reassurance, even if you don't have all the answers. And if you can put yourself in the mind frame of being glad to be there, you will come across more warm, more open, less aloof, and less potentially hostile, which sometimes happens by accident when we feel anxious and show up in public dreading being there, or with the little voice in our head saying, I just want to get in and get out. I just want to get over this as quickly as possible. So seizing the spotlight is one. It's not always intuitive, but we're having a moment where the ability to recognize that in a position of power, you also stand for something, you're a symbol of something, and people need to see that you are in control and in charge in order for them to relax and be able to do their job. The second way to power up that I want to talk about has to do with the way you deal with decision making. And Jacinda Ardern is a great example from New Zealand. I think she's handled a lot of these challenges especially well, and she's received a lot of accolades for it. She's walking this line in terms of her decision-making very effectively by both relying on medical experts, as she is in this video that she posted on YouTube with her 2 chief science advisors, but she's also, as you see in this picture, getting out in front of her advisors and her cabinet and taking personal responsibility for the decisions that she's making. So it's this combination of being willing to listen to the experts and then own accountability for your decisions that I think is very, very important in terms of decision-making in this type of situation. A lot of times in positions of power, we have a tendency to think, you know, we have two choices. We can either take total control of decisions we have to make, you know, not consult anybody, make the decision ourselves, and hopefully be accountable for it, or we can just delegate the decision, let others make the decision, and push accountability down. And I want to suggest to you that that's a false dichotomy. There's actually quite a range of ways you can kind of move between totally authoritative and more participative modes of decision making. So in this particular chart, this is from a model from research by Vic Broom at Yale, showing that really you have kind of 5 actual choices that range from, you know, in A1, using the information you already have to make a decision without input, and from G2, working with your team to reach a consensus and just facilitating their making the decision themselves, right? There are these modes in the middle, which is where I think we want to be operating under crisis conditions when trying to show strength, which is, again, to get input from experts, because there's no way to know everything when there's as much uncertainty as we're dealing with now, but then to actually take ownership of the decisions that you make. And here's a great example of how someone has done this recently. This is the CEO of Carta, who had to go through a series of layoffs early in the pandemic, and just took accountability by saying, you know, don't be mad at your managers. I personally reviewed every list and every person who was being considered. And it says, in fact, your manager fought to keep you and I overrode them. They're blameless. If today's your last day, there's only one person to blame, and it's me, right? So that personal accountability and responsibility gives people a sense that you are capable of putting their interests first by putting yourself in the crosshairs. And the third thing I want to talk about, we'll spend just a few more minutes on this because it's kind of fun, is the idea of taking more space as a way of showing strength in a leadership role. So let me just say that it's really interesting to look at this picture of Christine Lagarde in a meeting with a bunch of other male economic officials. And it's so clear in this picture how much stronger and more capable she looks than the three of them. And again, this is just based on how she looks. So very interesting to notice, I assume none of these people were aware that their picture was being taken. Many of us sit in whatever way makes us feel comfortable without giving it, you know, a moment's thought, but we often do things with our bodies that undermine our strength and authority. And what you can see here is that in contrast to the men around her, Christine Lagarde has kept her chest very open as opposed to kind of rolling her shoulders forward and collapsing in on herself, which is a very common reaction to feeling stress and also concentrating. She's also got an elbow out, so she's expanding the size of her footprint. And this is also part of what it means to take up space physically as a way of showing strength. So without spending too much time on this, let me just say that I go into a lot of detail in the book that I just published in April called Acting with Power, about the nonverbal ways that we communicate dominance and deference. And the upshot is that we're negotiating power all the time in our lives. And just like other types of animals, humans have conversations with one another about who gets to have power, who's going to be able to dominate, and who defers, using our bodies in the way you see in these pictures. So a dominant physical posture tends to be associated with being more expansive, taking up more physical space, where deference is associated with making yourself smaller by bowing down, by closing your shoulders in, and also in the way that you stand. So just a couple more examples here and things for you to consider. I'm going to rely on Christine Lagarde just for a moment because I know a lot of you know who she is, and she's just a master with her body language. So you notice a lot of things here just in terms of how she's standing. She's taking space by closing in on other people, which seems to be giving her the upper hand in some of these pictures. Leaning over people is another interesting one. So she's using her physical height in that way. And it's very interesting to look at these pictures where these people have their hands on one another's shoulders and necks. So touching someone also is a way of taking space. It's a way of deciding that you get to say where the social boundaries are. And it's something to be very aware of. But I wanted to point out to you that it is a tactic that power holders use as a way of maintaining the upper hand, is to close the physical distance between themselves and other people, to invade other people's space, get in their bubble, and also touch them. And it's interesting, actually, the higher up on a person's body you touch them, the more dominant it is. So you can see down here, they're having a power contest by moving their hands. She's got her arm on his shoulder, he's got her hand on her neck, which is a very dominant move. I'm not going to be able to show you that video, but I just wanted to point out that one of the things that, the President of the United States is very known for his use of dominance. I would say it's probably what he's most known for in my mind. And it's very instructive, independent of ideology, to just look at how he uses his body and the impact that it has. The video I wanted to show you was an example of how he claims space at a table. So he expands his turf as a way of reminding everyone that he's in charge and, maybe the most important person at the table. And if you're interested, I won't have time to go through this with you right now, but if you're interested, I would highly recommend that you Google President Trump's negotiations with other world leaders in the realm of handshaking. He has a very dominant handshake where for quite a while he was able to physically control other world leaders by pulling them into him and throwing them off balance. But a number of world leaders have figured this out and have developed some good strategies for disarming that particular approach. So these are all just ways of showing that taking space as a way of showing strength can be very, very effective, and there are many, many ways to do it. Other examples, I would highly recommend looking at Nancy Pelosi's use of physical space and her body as a way of being dominant, showing strength and controlling other people. And it's interesting to look at why dominance has the impact that it has. Being physically expansive, using your arms, keeping your chest open, and closing in on other people are all ways that we signal that we're not afraid to have a fight, and that we might even be willing to use physical force if it was necessary. And of course, it doesn't have to mean that this is the message you're sending, but this is the message that physical expansiveness has. And it's almost like we process these things in a very primitive part of our brain. So the nonverbal dominance kind of goes under the radar for people in ways that verbal dominance doesn't. I often advise people too, something for you to experiment with in case you're challenged by this. I work with a lot of young company founders in Silicon Valley who are transitioning from having started a company where they have a lot of technical expertise and competence to being the CEO of a company that's got millions of dollars of investment and has employees. And they often have to learn how to use their body in different ways to show up and role in a way that makes others feel secure and confident in their leadership. So we sometimes advise people to think of putting on a headdress before going into an important meeting. And you can experiment with this in the privacy of your own home. If you imagine for a moment that you have something on your head like what you see in this picture, just notice what that does to your physical posture. So in order to keep a heavy headdress on your head has to be perfectly straight, your neck has to be long, and you have to be relatively still, which is an important way of showing strength and dominance. So these are just some of the tactics I've seen leaders use effectively in the context of the pandemic. If you're looking for more tips, again, I recommend that you look at the book. I spent a lot of time on this. So when others feel maximally powerless and you want to be a base of security for others, it's important to have skills and ways, techniques of powering up. let me just take a few more minutes to say a little bit more about what I mean and what I don't mean here, and then I would love to take your questions about this. So when I talk about using dominance, playing power up, and being authoritative, I'm talking about being using strength and not being authoritarian. And this distinction is very important, I think, in the context of remembering this graph. So authoritativeness can be a tool for protecting other people, right? It doesn't have to be in that authoritarian mode of using force to protect your own position, which is what I see more as an authoritarian style of leadership. So as a key to keep in the back of your mind, you can think of, your goal as a power holder as trying to provide a base of security in a situation where everyone feels insecure. And this guidance comes from a former hostage negotiator whose perspective on power and leadership comes from understanding how important it is to be able to disarm people. So he talks about being calm under pressure, in touch with reality, but also seeing positive potential, really listening, focusing on what's positive, being willing to take a personal risk to take care of someone else, and being fully present or approachable. So we want to be able to use both strength and compassion. Let me just say a little bit in the few moments that I have left about compassion. And the idea of when you might want to play your power down. So I've talked about how in times of crisis, it's very important to be able to seize your authority and own your power and use it without fear. But there are situations in which sometimes the best way to deal with people in a power context is to show that you don't intend to use the power you have to harm them as a way of getting them to step back as well. And we have seen this approach to using power and the compassion side also being very important in our country, and I'm sure we see this all around the world. In terms of dealing with peaceful protesters, it's another case in which, law enforcement officers and political leaders need to make decisions about whether to escalate dominance quickly or show compassion. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the willingness to stand down and show compassion is sometimes a better approach to keeping things peaceful than rapidly escalating into dominance. So not to say compassion is not important, I just wanted to emphasize in the time we have how, although it's counterintuitive and many of us are ideologically opposed to the idea of using hierarchy and power in an authoritative way, there are many times situations in which that is very important. So the big thing I want to leave you with is that, this is a quote from my colleague at Stanford: "Good leaders during shutdowns think about everyone else first and themselves last," which is, I think, the key to using power well. And the idea of moving from a position where you're dominated by your own fear and uncertainty in these difficult times to a situation where you can show compassion and caring for others because it's part of your responsibility as the person in charge. So let me stop there and say thanks for your attention. There's a picture of my book there, and I think there'll be a link for those of you who might be interested in learning more about it. And what I'm going to do is stop sharing my screen and go into, let's see, I have comments in both Q&A and chat. Let's start with the Q&A. Okay, someone would like to share the Acting with Power slide on LinkedIn. You can always find me at my Stanford email address, deborahg@stanford.edu. You can email me and I'd be happy to send you a slide. Any suggestions on how to take up space in a virtual world? I will, and will I share the slides? Yes, I definitely can. So in the virtual world, this is, I think, super interesting. And it's something people have been asking me about a lot lately. So I would say, what's very interesting is to think about, I guess, a couple things. The first one is the way you speak. So I didn't have time to talk about this too much, but in a virtual world, we really have only two things at our disposal. We're like, from the shoulders up and the way that we use our voices. So let me just talk for a moment about speaking. One of the things I've learned from dealing with professional actors is that when they are learning to embody a high status or high power character, they speak much more slowly than they do when playing a low status or more deferential character. And the idea is that speaking slowly is another way of taking space. So I'm doing it now. It's speaking in a way that signals that every word I say is worth the time that I'm taking. Whereas when we speak very quickly, which I probably have done some of on this webinar too, part of the message we're sending is that we're not sure the time we're taking is worth it. We're not sure what we're saying is worth the time we're taking. So speaking more slowly is definitely a good way of showing strength and using power. Being comfortable with silence virtually is another one where, you know, if you are always the first person to fill the silence, it suggests you're uncomfortable with silence. And so, you know, holding the silence can be a way of getting other people to act more deferential. And then another speaking tip that you can try is that, again, actors use this technique when speaking authoritatively. It's important to end your sentences on a down pitch. So I just did that. Instead of ending your sentences on a down pitch, that was an up pitch. So ending your sentences on a down pitch. There's something about ending on the down note that suggests the conversation is over. And the other is that you can articulate your consonants as a way of sounding more authoritative. So an example would be, let's see if I can think of an example. If I say the word respect like that, it has a different impact than if I say respect, right? It's more authoritative. It's almost like you use the consonants as a weapon in the acting realm. So thinking about how you speak can be very useful in a virtual environment. And I think also very important just to think about things like how close to your screen you are. Are you, you know, it's when your camera is in a different direction than your audience, I think it suggests that may suggest that you're aloof, which is different than being, you know, fully engaged. So these are things that we can all work on. All right, let me see if I can switch. There's so many great questions coming in. How would be a good use of power in family relationships? Oh yeah, well this usually comes up quickly, so I'm not surprised to see that. Of course, I always talk about these things in business context, and people go right away to understanding that in all of our relationships, there is a balance of power that has to be managed. Any of the techniques that I'm describing to you can be useful in any context. I think the thing to recognize is that there's a mistake sometimes in marriages, for example, in striving for equality. And what I mean by that is that I don't actually believe it's possible for people to be equally powerful at any given moment. So one of the background findings from research to the talk I'm giving today is that people tend to form hierarchies in all their relationships almost instantly, whether the task requires it or not, because it's one of the ways we cooperate with one another. If we're haggling for power and status all the time, it becomes impossible to get any work done. And in fact, a really interesting research finding on this is that if you look at chickens, chickens are very hierarchical, and I actually have 4 chickens right now, so I get to watch them whenever I want. When chickens have a clear, strict hierarchy, so everybody knows who eats first, who gets to roost the highest, they're not fighting about it, they're more productive in terms of eggs. Because when we're haggling for status and power, it's hard to focus on anything else. We don't have enough energy and resources for anything else. So back to marriage, what I think counts for equality is to think of the idea of trading off who gets to be the decider. And what that means is in any given realm, in any given moment, one of you will care more than the other. And a good way to have a useful and I think harmonious balance of power is to have each party have the right to be the decider in certain domains, but not in others. So that's one way to think about it. But power dynamics are rampant in all family relationships, and that's another talk. I'd love to come back and talk with you more about that. Let me see what else is in the Q&A. Yeah, this is a great one. So for someone who's in a professional relationship where they feel like all the power lies with their boss, what do you suggest to do to feel less powerless? This is a great question, and I brushed over it quickly in the talk. This is something that I coach people on a lot, especially at Stanford and academia, mentoring younger faculty members and trying to figure out how to, and graduate students, how to figure out how to manage relationships where they feel like they don't have as much power as they need. So there are two things I would say about this. The first one is to say, it was great the way the question was asked, how to handle it when you feel like all the power lies with your boss. So the first thing I would say is be very mindful and try to separate your feelings from reality. That's the first thing. So we have a tendency in a boss-subordinate relationship to quickly assume that the boss has all the power and we have no power at all. And your boss may have more power than you do, but not necessarily. So what that means is if they control how much money we make, if they control what projects we're put on, if they have the right to fire us and we can't affect their outcomes in the same ways, they have more power than you. And so you want to be very careful about using too much strength and dominance in a relationship like that, right? So it's very important as part of a hierarchical relationship at work that the boss trusts that you respect their position. I think that's a basic thing. But what I also want to say is that in any relationship, including a boss-subordinate relationship, both parties need one another. And if both parties need one another, that means you both have power. That means you both have leverage. It means that to the extent that your boss wants to keep you happy, you have power. And you can use that power in a way to manage the balance. One of the things I advise people to do all the time is to make sure that whenever possible, they have alternatives to the relationships that they're in. And this is useful for work, especially, gets more controversial in the personal realm. But in a work context, if you are networking well, if you're always in contact with people, if people are putting feelers out to see whether you're interested in jobs elsewhere, you have a lot of power relative to your boss if they want you to stay. If you don't have any alternatives, they have much more power over you, right? Because then you really have to fear losing your job or getting on the wrong side of this person. So very important to think about what are your alternatives to this relationship, and is there something you can do to increase the strength of your options so that you don't have to buy into a fiction, possibly, that your boss has more power than you do. So I'd say that's probably the most important thing. Some bosses are open to having conversations about this, others are not, but I think one of the things that I've learned from dealing with a lot of executives is that they actually want to be good bosses also. So there are those who throw their weight around and make you feel small for the fun of it. That's a different breed. If you feel like you can trust your boss's intentions, you can have these conversations and just say, you know, here are some areas in which I wish I had more control. Here are some areas in which I'm having trouble taking responsibility for my own decisions because I feel like I don't have enough power. I don't have the right to do these things. So sometimes you can have conversations with people about this thing. Let's see. So there's a question here about working as a foreigner in a company. Okay, so coming in as an outsider, it looks like in a position of power when your status may be low. So that's maybe one way to think about it, right? How to manage. And I think it's a great question for thinking about, you know, people who work in multinational corporations, people who are expatriates, people who are, brought into a company in another part of the world with responsibility for managing others when they may not trust you and they may not respect you based on the fact that you're not an insider. There's similar types of problems. Women have these problems in many organizations. Race can be an issue, sexual orientation. There are so many contexts in which there's a question about your power and a separate question about your status. That is, whether people respect you or not. And I guess what I would say is that the most important thing to keep in mind in terms of dealing with your status, like making sure that others respect you, is to make sure that you are very clearly indicating at every opportunity that their interests are at least as important as yours to you. So taking that last quote that I shared from Rob Siegel about putting other people first, one of the things that happens when people don't trust or respect us because we have outsider status is that they worry that we're going to be looking out for ourselves. That, one of the things that makes us untrustworthy is we're not an insider, maybe we don't care about them. So I always advise people in situations like that to start by trying to take personal risks to help them and demonstrate with your actions over and over again that even though you are an outsider, you're really genuinely interested in behaving in a way that's good for them. Sometimes, something else to think about in situations like that is that there can be a challenge of like being in a meeting where most people are acting like they respect you, but one of them is not. I think that tends to be the common thing. So there's somebody who's kind of testing you and others are not cooperating. It's important to suss those situations out, but I do think it's important in a position of power to take those individuals who are not behaving in a way that's consistent with reality in terms of your roles and reporting relationships, to take those people aside and have a one-on-one conversation and tell them to cool it. If you don't stop the bad behavior, then it's not safe for the good guys to do what's best for you. So, and that's where the strength comes in. Sometimes it's important to shut someone down, to tell them they've spoken too many times, you need to hear from someone else. If they show up late to a meeting, to take them outside and say, you can't come late to my meetings, go back to your office. These are all very authoritative things. But again, keeping in mind that when you do them in order to benefit the culture in the group, it's not mean, it's generous. It's protecting others from the influence of negative people. All right, let me just see what else we have going on here. Looking at the time. Do I believe birth order impacts relationships to power? It does. It does. This is super interesting. So what research shows is that this is research that's looked at the power motive, which is just a measure of personality-wise how interested we are in power, and then how we use the power we have. So one of the things that you find in general in the research literature is that people who have a very strong power motive, a very strong drive for power and control, are at risk often of using that power irresponsibly in the way that I've described. So they will make choices to serve their own interests and lose their job, for example. They're also more prone to marital problems and to addiction problems. So a very strong drive for power is often associated with these kinds of selfish and self-destructive behaviors, except in a few cases, and one of them has to do with birth order. So this is super interesting. Older children, oldest children with a high need for power are not as prone to corruption as babies of the family in particular, like only children or the youngest baby of the family. Those family members with a very strong need for power tend to get caught up in these impulse control problems, but the oldest child doesn't. And what psychologists think is going on, and I think this is very compelling, is that as the oldest child, you learn at a very young age that more vulnerable, more needy people's interests come first, right? I'm the oldest child in my family. If you're the oldest child in your family, one of the things you learn is that you can't always do exactly what you want when the new baby comes, because the new baby has to sleep and the new baby has to eat and the new baby is crying. And so you learn to wait and be patient and delay gratification earlier, specifically because there are needier people in your family. And the idea is that when you learn how to put others' needs first from an early age, even with a very high need for power, you're less prone to scandals and more prone to use power responsibly to protect and take care of other people later in life as a consequence of that socialization. A related finding is that the same pattern is true if you compare men and women. And I think the explanation is the same, which is that, you know, boys and girls are socialized differently. Girls tend to be socialized to take care of others and put others' needs first, where boys tend to be socialized to, you know, advance and compete. And you do see also that women with power are less prone to impulse control issues and scandals actually than men are. And this may be one of the reasons. So I think that's a super interesting question. I think maybe the Q&A tends to be, it looks like the Q&A is closed. There's a lot in the chat. But we're very close to the end here. Yeah, most of these are just, thank you very much, I'm leaving. So let me just say, since we're so close to the end, thank you so much for being here with me. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for the great questions. And again, if you want to learn more about this, I have a book that just came out. And I will do my very best to respond to those of you who have reached out to me via the ASMALLWORLD platform. I just have to figure out how to use it. So thank you so much and be well.